Today we're looking at friction in the workplace, and I want to make sure be sensitive to the fact that I know many of us might be without work right now, or maybe just your responsibilities in life don't involve a workplace. I think what we're going to talk about today carries a little bit further than just the workplace itself, but to any place where we're with others and doing stuff together. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 20 if you want to head over there, looking at a good portion of that, but we're going to do it in two different parts. And really what we're going to look at is a couple situations with the disciples where some friction comes up related to working together. The first situation has to do with preferential treatment. Anyone ever complained about preferential treatment? Don't raise your hands. If you've ever been with somebody else, you've probably at least thought about preferential treatment. And the second one has to do with kind of undeserved promotion or an undeserved position. Once again, don't raise your hand, but anyone ever complain that maybe the supervisor shouldn't have their job or somebody else got promoted when you should have? Strangely, these things are taking place in conversation all the way back in biblical times. So it's not like they're new to our relationships as humans. Let's start. I just want to read through a parable here to get us started. And we're going to look at this in two different parts. We're going to read through chapter 20, verses 1 through 15. We'll take a little time to work through that. Then we'll jump to verses 20 through 28. So we'll kind of take this in two parts, and hopefully we'll get this all fit into the time frame that we have here. So starting in Matthew chapter 20, this is actually a parable that Jesus is telling coming out of chapter 19. We've just had the account with the rich young ruler, which many of us may know, where he wants to know how he can inherit eternal life, and the disciples have said, well, we gave up everything when he walks away, and Jesus actually is telling this parable kind of in response to that. In fact, if you look at the last verse of chapter 19, it says, and many who are last will be first, and then he wraps it up again in verse 16, so the last will be first and the first will be last. We're not going to dig a lot into what's going on there with that. We're going to stick more to what's going on in the relationships here that we see in this parable. So for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. If you're not sure what a denarius is, it's probably down in your footnotes that this was a customary wage for a day worker. So he's offered to pay them what they should make for doing the work he's asked them to do. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. So they went. He went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. So they're going to work till about 6 o'clock. So if you're wondering why is he hiring people at 5, it's because they're not getting off till about 6. So there's a little bit of time left here. We're in verse 6 there. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. He said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. Remember, that was the amount that he had promised to pay the first workers, right? So the last ones just got the same amount as the first ones. Verse 10. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them, I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? There's an interesting thing going on here, isn't there? So let's just work through a few questions, because I think this is a good way to kind of process passages of Scripture. What made the workers that were hired first upset? It's pretty straightforward there, right? They expected to get more. I mean, and they say that, like, hey, The deal should have changed. We saw these guys make a denarius, and we worked longer than they did, so we should get more. I mean, he even says to them, you've made them equal to us, right? They've worked hard. I mean, you don't necessarily have to do a show of hands, but kind of maybe in your own head, like, do you think they were justified in their complaint? I think a lot of us might say, yeah, that's definitely not fair. If you have kids, you know the fair argument shows up all the time, right? And so they're like, wait a second. We did more work and we didn't get more money? The landowner kind of looked at it differently, though, didn't he? So, let's take a look at that. How did he see this differently? He says, I'm not being unfair to you. What made him believe he wasn't being unfair? He paid them a fair wage. They agreed to it. We're starting to get interesting here, isn't it? We're starting to get a little bit of a hint that maybe us in the position of the workers, because I think that's where we usually find ourselves, right? Complaining that we didn't get what we now believe we deserve may not be what the landowner is really getting at. Look what he says. I want to give the one who was hired last the same. It's verse 14. Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Who took a loss? Who got cheated if we're going to play that game? Landowner, didn't he? Because the landowner paid these guys who worked an hour the full wage for the day. Think about that perspective for a minute, right? The workers hired first said, you cheated us, and he said, I didn't cheat you. I gave you exactly what I agreed to give you. If anyone got cheated here, it was the landowner. He could have got away with paying each person that came in. He says, I'll pay you what's right. And somehow in his mind, what was right was that everybody got paid the same amount. If you're wondering who the landowner is supposed to symbolize in this parable, this is God. This is Jesus kind of giving us an insight into the way the kingdom works, right? So we've got this idea of preferential treatment. And I think when we take it from the world's perspective, we buy that first argument. Oh, they're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. They got hired early on. He tricked them. He told them, I'll give you a denarius. And then he went out all throughout the day and he kept bringing other people in and he gave them all the same amount. And those guys got tricked. What they should have done was they should have hidden somewhere and then not come back out till 5 o'clock in the evening and got their job, right? Like, I mean, I know somebody here at least is scheming that way right now. Like, that's what I would have done. I would have shown up late, right? Yeah, we got somebody admitting to this. I don't know where the place is in Ventura where day laborers gather. I live up in Carpinteria, and I know that there's a street over by the rescue mission up there where the day laborers gather. And I go by that street usually about once a week because I do a class at the rescue mission that's there. And my class is at 12:30 in the day. And when I drive by, there's still people out there. I don't think anyone who's sitting out there is thinking, this is great, I got the day off. I think what they're thinking is, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to pay my rent? See, the landowner, I think if we take his argument, because Jesus kind of sided with him, we see a couple things going on here, right, when it comes to this idea of preferential treatment. How we kind of smooth this out and get past the friction. We can begin to value generosity over personal gain. Isn't that the last thing he says, right? Are you envious because I'm generous? In the Hebrew there, it's actually, do you have an evil eye because I'm good? It's this concept of like, you're looking at this situation with evil intent because I've decided to do something good. The character or the lack of character that's exposed is actually the workers. They're the ones lacking character. by saying, I didn't get treated fairly. I've changed the rules of the game. I should have got more because of what you did. And this happens so much in our relationships, doesn't it? Something doesn't go the way we expect it to. And we start pointing fingers, and we start placing blame, and we start trying to figure out where I got ripped off, where I didn't get what I deserved, instead of valuing the generosity. And in fact, I think it goes even further than that. Because what's really going on here is the notion coming out of that account of the rich young ruler is this balance of grace and works, right? Because this is really a parable about the kingdom of God and salvation. What Jesus is really getting at here is that whether you come in at the very end of your life, or whether you were born into the church and embraced a relationship with Jesus and lived your life serving Him, we all receive the same reward at the end. But He wants us to live that same kingdom generous principle out in everything that we do. And so it requires us to see human need as a higher priority than what's earned by our works. Look at what He does, right? Verse 6, about 5 p.m, He went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? See, I think a lot of us read that verse with an accusation in it, right? What's wrong with you that you've been out here all day doing nothing? I think we assume there's a laziness. I think we read into this a lot of times in other people's lives. We see them maybe struggle with a task they've been assigned. We see them not show up on time. And we begin to give them all sorts of qualities and traits that we've assigned to them without any knowledge of their situation. And then it's unfair that they don't get fired, and it's unfair that they don't get disciplined, because look at how hard I work. But look what they say, right? Verse 7. Because no one has hired us. They got there at the same time as everybody else. They've been out there since he went out early in the morning. What was it, 6 a.m. when he goes out to hire them at first? But nobody's hired them. And so what the landowner does, what Jesus does, is he looks and he goes, you know what? You have need, and I want to meet that need. It's not about the work that needs to be done. There's not a single one of us sitting here that Jesus needs to be doing work so that He can get something accomplished. He is fully capable apart from us. He invites us in to participate with Him because He wants us there. And what He wants to do is meet our need. And if we would enter relationships with others with a sense of grace and generosity and wanting to see their needs met, then maybe when we see that person struggle, instead of complaining that they don't get fired, we would form a relationship with them. We'd take them out to lunch and say, hey, what can I do to help you? What can I do to help you succeed here, to make sure that your needs continue to be met? And so we get this whole different perspective. In fact, Ephesians chapter 2, we love to quote this, but we don't often want to talk about what it really looks like, right? But this is kind of a great illustration of that. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. There's no preferential treatment in the kingdom, and there shouldn't be any preferential treatment in our relationships. So we can remove that friction if we start to look through the eyes of the landowner. We start to value generosity. We start to seek out need instead of what I get and what I want and what's fair. But let's move on to the next part. Matthew, so Jesus now goes on, he predicts his death again. By the way, every time he does this, the disciples completely miss it. The reason they completely miss it is because Jesus can't die. He's come here to overthrow the Romans and to establish this kingdom, and we're going to be rulers, right? And that's actually the trouble that we're getting into now, because at the end of verse 19, he had talked about these thrones that were going to be established, and they would sit on these thrones. And now they're thinking, we got to work out who's in what throne here. So a couple of these guys get this idea to get mommy involved. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down asked a favor of him, right? Jesus isn't going to turn down the mother. What is it you want, he asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. These are the most esteemed positions she's asking for. I know there's going to be 12 thrones. You talked about it back there, judging Israel. I want to make sure my sons get the best ones. Here's what's really interesting, though, right? Verse 22. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said to them. Notice, not to her, to them. He knows what's going on. Good job, James and John. Send your mother over to do your dirty work. So he turns to them. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time in this little section of what he's said to them. There's a lot going on here. They think he's saying one thing and talking about some things going on in this physical world. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven and his death. They still don't get it. For our purpose, we're not going to dig into that because we have limited time here. I want to get into what happens next here, right? Because here's this part, this undeserved promotion, right? Verse 24, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Indignant, by the way, has a notion of being upset that something's unfair. So we're back to fairness again. We've really got to kick this like when we're 6 years old, but it just carries with us through our whole lives. Verse 25, Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. In 1895, there was a man named Robert Ingersoll. He was a writer and orator. There's a supposed Abraham Lincoln quote about power that actually wasn't something Lincoln said. It was something that this man said about Lincoln. And I want to read you the quote here. Nothing discloses real character like the use of power. It is easy for the weak to be gentle. Most people can bear adversity. But if you wish to know what a man really is, give him power. This is the supreme test. It is the glory of Lincoln that having almost absolute power, he never abused it, except on the side of mercy. You might see where we're going here again already, right? The disciples were indignant because the request for the best chairs was made by somebody else before they got the chance to make the request. That's what's really going on here. Let's think about that for a moment, right? They're not upset so much that the request was made. They're upset because, hey, I want that seat. None of us are ever upset at work if somebody we believe should have a position gets a position, are we? In fact, a lot of times we're really happy for them. But when we think we should be getting something and we think somebody else is getting out ahead of us, that's where the friction shows up. And that's what's going on here. These guys have been fighting for status and position the whole time. This group of ragtag fishermen and handymen and whatever else they are. And they're starting to realize, like, hey, I think Jesus is he's talking about being a king. I think he's going to have this kingdom. He keeps talking about this. This is kind of exciting because we're going to have some power and authority. Because they've been beat up. And so now they're fighting amongst themselves. The question they're asking really is kind of more, what about me? How come he gets it? Right? I mean, that's where the issues come from, is it not, in our workplace? We start to do these comparisons. Jesus does a comparison for them. It's not a real flattering comparison, though, is it? He compares their desire for the best seat with the Roman leaders that they want him to overthrow. In other words, what Jesus says is right now where you are in your development, in your growth, in your life, if you had their seat, we'd be in just as bad a situation. And a lot of times, that's true about us, isn't it? The very fact that we're complaining that somebody else is getting something we think they don't deserve or that we should deserve shows that we're lacking some kind of character, some kind of humility, some kind of willingness to see others do well. A lot of times somebody gets promoted and we think, well, now I'm going to make sure I kind of undercut them. I'm going to perform worse so that they don't look very good in this position because I should have been the supervisor. You know, we see this all throughout the church today, unfortunately. The desire to have political power or religious power because there's a status that comes with it, or the ability to have control or to even take advantage of others. That's in fact what Jesus says is going on, right? He says that the leaders of the Gentiles lord it over them. In other words, they flaunt their authority and their power. Right? We hear this. We hear this from politicians. We hear this from leaders in businesses. That I can do what I want. The rules don't apply to me. Exercising authority over them. It's this idea of controlling people for my gain. And the scary thing is that Jesus says to these disciples, and I think sometimes to us at times, your attitude makes you exactly the same as these leaders. But he wants them to understand that in the kingdom, leadership is very, very different. Right? Not so with you. Those 4 words are so key. And what I want us to remember here, these 2 guys that come, James and John, are going to do phenomenal stuff for the kingdom. James is going to be martyred. John's going to write Revelation. He's going to be on the island of Patmos suffering. Like they are going to give up their life. When Jesus says, oh yeah, you're going to drink my baptism, he's letting them know something's coming that they don't understand is coming. Like these guys are going to get there. And that's the exciting part, right? Because we too often believe that every time we pick up somebody in the Bible who we know ends up well, that they're the same person when we see them, but they're not there yet. It's going to take the growth. It's going to take the things that take place. So we have a chance here. Not so with you. They're growing. They're learning. Jesus is being patient. He's teaching them. And he says, you want to figure this out? You want to get past this place where you're always striving for power? Let me tell you what it is to actually be at the top. It's to be at the bottom. Remember me, God in the flesh, gave up my rights in heaven. This is Philippians chapter 2. Gave it all up so that I could come here and die for you. And by the way, you guys are miserable right now. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He says that's what it is to lead. It's to lay yourself down for a bunch of people that don't deserve it. So you really want to be in charge? You really want power? That's when we're ready. When we don't want to be served. When it's not like, I want that corner office because I'm going to have a secretary who brings me my drinks every morning. I get whatever I want. And we realize that it's a huge responsibility that God puts upon us. You want to get past the friction of striving for position. Start by understanding what the position really means in the kingdom of God. I got to become the executive director of the organization that I work at 6 months before the pandemic. That's fantastic timing. It was right about the point that I thought maybe I knew what my job was. And so for the past almost year and a half now that we've been doing this, my job every day is to make sure that people get paid, that their fear is settled because they know there's a security, that they're continuing to learn and grow. It's not a glorious thing to be in charge. It's got a massive amount of stress. And if we can get there, if you want to, turn to Genesis 45. This is where we're going to end. I want to give you a better example than me. Joseph. This is Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, for those wanting to figure out which Joseph we're talking about here. Right? This is Joseph, who's, when we first meet him, he's a 17-year-old, as I like to call him, a 17-year-old punk. He is so self-absorbed that when he has 2 dreams from the Lord about his brothers bowing down to him, he goes and brags about the fact that, hey, guess what I dreamed last night? You guys are going to bow before me. His brothers, if you're unfamiliar with the story, really, really like that idea. And so what they think is, well, let's help him with this process. And they throw him in a pit so he can die. Then they sell him off as a slave. And Joseph goes through this amazing journey, which all of us, I'm sure, want, from favored son to almost dead in a pit to slave in Potiphar's house, who was one of the Pharaoh's, officials, to leading that, to just when things look like they're going to go really good, to accused of trying to sleep with the guy's wife, in a dungeon where he thinks he's going to die because he's interpreted some dreams and told him, hey, when you get out, some of Pharaoh's other officials, when you get out, let them know about me, and they forget about him. That's the course that Joseph takes. To get to the point where one day somebody remembers and they pull him out of jail, out of the dungeon, and he becomes number 2 in all of Egypt. And here's where we mess this up in the United States. Because we think that's when Joseph has arrived. We make the mistake of believing that Joseph has arrived because he's moved from the dungeon to the second highest position in the land. And we do that because we live out the American dream and not the dreams of God. Because the dreams of God were that his brothers would bow before him, and that hasn't happened. So everything that's taken place in Joseph's life to that point still isn't the fulfillment of what God had. But all this stuff goes on. There's a famine. Joseph's doing things. His brothers finally come before him. There's this long encounter that takes place. But what I want to look at is just a couple verses here where Joseph makes himself known to his brothers. He sends everybody out of the room. And he says, come close to me. This is in verse 4 of chapter 45. He says, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. This is not a happy moment for his brothers. Hold on. The number 2 in Egypt, who we sold into slavery, who he just reminded us about, who has the power to do anything he wants to us, is standing right before us. But look what he says in verse 5. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. What had happened in the chapter before is because of his position, they had come in not knowing who he was, and they bowed before him. And what Joseph said to them was, the dreams come true. And it wasn't about my authority, it was about your life. You see, if we can get past the notions of preferential treatment and who's in charge. And we can really focus in on the need that people have and why God has put us where he's put us, so that we can care for others in the example of Christ, that we would lay down our life. Then the friction just disappears. Because it only exists because of my selfish desires, my selfish ambition, my desire to get ahead. But if we just lay it down, it's gone. Now that's the hard part, right? That's why we're all still at it. But being a work in progress is not a problem. I would encourage you to read through Genesis and the life of Joseph, what it took for him to get from 17-year-old, very impressed with himself, young man, to the maturity that it took to have his brothers bow down before him and tell them, we are here together because God's using me to help you. It's a process. So just take the first step today, which might be nothing more than saying, God, I just want to know how you're using me. What do you have for me? What need could I see? Where am I being selfish? I think we can do that, right?